Welcome to TSC Talks, the podcast inspired by the condition known as tuberous sclerosis complex, which causes benign tumors to grow in all the major organs of the body. This podcast is directly for those affected, parents, caregivers, anyone who's ever struggled to make sense of unimaginable circumstances and find a way. Buckle up. We're going for a ride outside the box, off the grid, down many a rabbit hole, and back as we wrangle away to case manage and stay sane. Talk about it. Compare notes. Find the experts. Pick their brains. No magic bullet, but we are not alone. And now, your host, Jill Woodworth.
Hello, thank you for tuning in. I hope you appreciated that wild intro that we're trying out. That was by a Fiverr guy that we hired. I'm not sure if we're going to keep it, but we're trying it out now. So I hope he learned something about TSC through recording that intro. My next guest is Ruth D. Fisher, Ph.D. She is co-founder of Cann Dynamics. Cann Dynamics is a technology company dedicated to making medical cannabis metrics meaningful and conveniently accessible for people who use cannabis to treat their medical conditions. And her book that we're going to talk about is the Medical Cannabis Primer. I highly recommend that you go get this, just chock full of resources, pictures, detailed information that's easily understandable about medical cannabis for patients and healthcare professionals. Ruth talks about her formative influences, how she ended up in this space, the cannabis space, coming from, as an economist, and some of her career experiences that helped her formulate this book, and talks a lot about the healthcare industry and the cognitive dissonance. I love that term, between traditional medicine and cannabinoid medicine, and why there is such friction, what can be done to change this. So that's a great discussion. I'm not going to go on about it because, like I said, it's an intense interview. There's a lot of details, and I really hope that you listen. Also, coming up on the podcast, well, not on the podcast, kind of as a part of the podcast, we're going to be launching a botanical shot, which is something new for us. You're going to be hearing more about it. I'm not going to disclose much more, but we're working with the team, some interesting individuals that are involved in this, and you definitely want to stay tuned. This botanical shot does some amazing things. So that's coming up. We got great guests in the lineup. If there's anybody that you want to hear, reach out to us, tsctalks.com. You can find us on all the major channels. Thank you so much, Ruth. You can check out Medical Cannabis Primer on Amazon, and there's a website, medicalcannabisprimer.com. Thanks so much, Ruth, for being on, and take it away.
Thank you, Ruth. It's the pleasure of interviewing Ruth Fisher on the podcast today. And Ruth, you are the author of the Medical Cannabis Primer, among other things. That's what caught my attention, just because I had talked to another guest that mentioned it and explained to me this book. I had to get this book. There were pictures all over the place, and it was, easy to understand, but it was really, gave you a lot of solid knowledge, and I bought it, and it's awesome. So here you are. Tell me about your life. Tell me about your early, your career, and what led you to go into the field that you're currently in, and kind of will lead into the conversation about how you got into cannabis. So
Okay. So my dad, he was a private practice physician. He was a children's eye doctor, and he was my idol. And he had a very strong influence on me, and he was very moral, and he taught me by living a moral life and not just saying do this, but actually, showing me the way to do things. I remember at one point very vividly, he was in bed and he said, "Oh, I'm not feeling good. I wish I could just stay home." And I'm like, "Well, why don't you just stay in bed?" He says, "No, I have to get up. A lot of people are depending on me." And I think about that a lot. So it was things like that I experienced daily that had a profound impact on my view of the world and my desire to be a moral person and do what's right. My dad was also an iconoclast. He didn't take things at face value just because people said that that was so. He did research in his area in medicine, and he questioned authority, and he encouraged us to do so. And he would send us stuff to read a lot. And he would send an article and say, read this article. I'm like, Dad, just tell me what it says. He says, no, I want you to read it yourself. And that was always a pain. But at some point, I realized he didn't want to bias the presentation of the information with kind of his view and his perspective. He wanted us to read it for ourselves and develop our own perspective or an interpretation on what we thought of it.
Wow.
I always thought that was very interesting. It took me a long time to appreciate that.
I bet. Yeah. Did you have discussions then about the materials that he would, the reading?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I mean, I have two siblings, and all of us feel that my dad was a very special person, and we all learned so much from him. He shaped our worlds, and he taught us to listen and to research and to think and to question and not just take things at face value.
Wow.
But all of us, he would, I go to my siblings' houses and they have the same books on their bookshelves because my dad sent copies to all of us.
That's so cool. My dad actually was very similar in a different way, but he was a voracious reader and, always giving us books and very infused with he was very passionate about theology and anyways, but yeah, he was very similar. So that's, it has such value to me now. I mean, I still have some of the books that he's given me and some I haven't even read yet. So
what's kind of funny is he would give me books and I'm like, no, Dad, I don't want to read it. He would be like, well, just put it on your bookshelf. So then he would come over to my house and he would look on my bookshelf and of course see all the books he gave me. And he would look and say, wow, you have some really great books here.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah, that was kind of funny. So when he was in his 50s, he had a heart attack. And that really was very extremely transformative. Rather than just kind of giving up or kind of taking things as they were, he went out and he started reading everything and he started doing research and trying to figure out, what was under his control and what could he do to take action to try and, minimize his risk. And so he did a lot of reading in that, and he was always, reading and discussing and sharing. And that's when I started learning about diet and nutrition and how important that was. And then later, he had a series of different symptoms, problems that he was dealing with on a regular basis. And it was atrial fib and migraine and irritable bowel. It's a combination of the three, and he believed that they were triggering one another. And he did a lot of reading on this. And there was information out there in the medical arena, but he didn't believe a lot of what the industry was saying. And he was doing his own research and talking to people and developing relationships with people who he could have a conversation with and discuss his ideas. And that also really kind of shaped my view on how to deal with things. The fact that, he was doing his own research and he wasn't just agreeing, he could disagree. And yet he could also kind of, find people to discuss it with, to try and, clarify what was going on. And there was a lot that people didn't know, but he was still trying to get clarity on it. But again, continually doing research and always reading new stuff and trying to figure out what was going on. And what was particularly interesting to me, it was very satisfying, as a matter of fact. So my dad passed away in 2005, and my GP, who was a good friend of my dad's, they became very close. I recently saw my GP, and he said, all the stuff your dad was doing on linking all these things with migraine and the gut and diet and everything, he was really ahead of his time.
Yeah. You got me a little teared up there talking about that. Yeah.
And again, it's not what he said, it's kind of how he lived his life and what he did that was so important to all of us. So he was definitely one huge factor in shaping how I lived my life, as I said. Another factor was graduate school. So I'm an economist. So in economics, you learn that everything is supply and demand. So you learn how, all markets are shaped by the forces of supply and demand, and you kind of understand things in those terms. But as important as that was, I used to sit in on these seminars. And in the seminars, they would be for the professors, held by the professors. And what they would do is they would host visiting lectures or visiting professors from all over who had done research and who had done a study and who wanted to present their study and get feedback, say, to, improve it for publication purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And so we'd go to these seminars, and each week they would discuss a different study, and we would hear kind of how the professors went about evaluating the studies and determining the validity. And when I started out, I used to get very frustrated because they used to spend almost all the time, if not all the time, discussing the data and details about the data or the methodology. And I would be sitting there thinking, well, just get to the results. And the results are what's really important, what's
Mm-hmm.
really interesting, rather. And finally, it was drummed into me that it doesn't matter what the results are if your data and methodology aren't valid. If they're not sound, then the results don't matter because they're meaningless.
Got it.
That was really, really important in forming kind of my attitudes about reading research and trying to evaluate whether or not I should consider them to be valid based on, the methodology and the data used. And it really, really impressed upon me the importance of good methodology in order to provide valid results.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, I can see how that would play into the career path that you're chosen. And the details and the methodology, it's so frustrating to not be a detail person, but to know that that's really important. So I would have had it beaten to me too. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. It took a long time, but I finally realized it. And now there's so many people and there's so many studies out there, and most people really don't know how to judge whether or not the study is good or not. And most people, they just read the headlines or the results and they just take that at face value. And so there's so much information out there that people are advocating that are based on studies that they haven't really evaluated whether or not it's a good study. And if it's not a good study, then the results just aren't valid.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially in this day and age of, the fake news and all that. And I will say that I think I have a little bit of knowledge just from my lived experience to look at an article and kind of get a sense of whether it's based on a good methodology and data, but not solid. I don't know. So this is really interesting and important.
And so then the third piece that was really important in shaping kind of how I approached things was my initial job experience. When I finished graduate school, I started working for a company, the management consulting company, and we did litigation support. So we worked with attorneys on behalf of clients who were engaged in lawsuits, and the lawsuits generally involved patent infringement or breach of contract.
Okay.
So one party did something to another party that caused damage, and it was our job to assess what that damages was. So when you hear that, say, Apple infringed on one of Google's patents, they were ordered to pay $500 million in damages. Well, where does that number come from? That's what we did. We came up with those numbers.
Wow, that's got to be complicated.
Yeah. And so really what you're doing, and I just kind of came up with this, and I thought it was very insightful, is it's a George Bailey analysis. So you're doing like a wonderful life, and you're saying, okay, well, if George Bailey had never lived, what would society have looked like?
Ooh.
What would the outcomes have been? And we were doing the exact same thing. If one party hadn't done something else in the market, then, how would the market have proceeded in the absence of that action? And so you have to create this parallel world that didn't exist, but you think would have existed. And you have to do it in a way that's very credible, that you can convince the other side or the judge or the jury that, that's very plausible. And so in order to be able to do that, you really need to understand all the different factors in the market and how they're interacting with each other to create outcomes.
Okay. Wow. That's really helpful. You explained it so I can understand it. So you have all these influences. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yes, and they all, and again, everyone's the product of their life experiences, and these are my experiences, and one thing shapes the next, and you go through life, as an accumulation of all your past experiences. And so I found that, after doing that, I started looking at the world in a much more systemic view, saying, okay, if you look at any particular situation, there's a combination of forces at play. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to change something, you have to understand how the forces are connected to one another. So in a lot of cases, you can't just change one thing and expect the whole thing to change. So for example, it kind of goes back to the weakest link theory that, if you have a supply chain and you get output and you feed part A into part B and part B into part C and part C into part D, if all of a sudden C goes offline, then it doesn't matter what you're doing at A and B, you're never going to get through to D.
Right.
And so one little piece has the power to break down the whole system and prevent it from working. And if you don't understand that C is there as a barrier and as a throughput, and that any problems with C is going to affect the guy at A and B, their success. So something can happen down the line that A and B have no control over, and it's, they're not their fault at all, but have complete, profound impact on their well-being or their outcome, their sales, then that's really important to understand.
Oh, yeah. So you're able to take a lot of information in and look at it from all kinds of different angles and perspectives and, use your education to form it into some kind of outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. And I can see how having that background and coming into the cannabis industry would be an extreme advantage, but also very frustrating.
Yeah, cannabis is an interesting industry. So I got into cannabis about 4 years ago or so now. Mm-hmm. About 5 years ago or more, my brother started having health problems. And it turns out he was eventually diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And MS manifests itself differently in different people. And the manifestation he gets is pain, a lot of neuropathic pain from different sources. And he was on a lot of different drugs trying to control or manage the pain, and they all have really, really ugly side effects. And while they were helping some, they weren't really doing enough. Mm-hmm. And at one point, one of my brother's neurologists said, maybe you could benefit from cannabis. And so I'm in California, and in California, the way it works is your doctors give you a note, and the note says you have a symptom, or a condition rather, that under the state of California enables you to have access to cannabis. Mm-hmm. And so essentially it was a note saying, yes, you can get cannabis. And the doctor said, but I don't really know anything about it, so you're kind of on your own. So he had used cannabis in, college, like all of us, or a lot of us, I should say. I don't mean to speak for everyone. That was a long time ago, and he didn't really think too much of it until he got to the dispensary. And all of a sudden, he's seen literally hundreds of different products, and he's seen all these words and nothing familiar, and he has no idea. Suddenly realizes he has absolutely no idea what he's doing. And he has to make some decision. What medication is he going to buy, and how is he going to take it?
Now, did you go with him to the dispensary for the first time?
No, I did not. I did not.
So he went by himself?
He went by himself, yes, I think.
Wow. Uh-huh.
And
I'm just visualizing that, walking into the, and thinking, oh, I'm going to get some relief here. And wow. So.
Yeah. And it's really important, I think, that if you're not faced with that situation, it's hard to understand. Mm-hmm. But, after thinking about it, I realized that, okay, we're trained, we have this mindset. And the way that medicine and healthcare works is we're not feeling good, so we go to the doctor, and the doctor gives us a prescription. And we go to the pharmacist, and the pharmacist has this lab coat, and we know they're certified, and we trust them.
Yep.
And we hand them this note from our doctor, and we can see all the bottles of pills on the shelves, but, we don't have to know what any of those mean. the pharmacist will go back into that room among the hundreds or thousands of bottles of medication and pick out the precise one for us. And they will hand it to us and say, okay, take 2 pills a day, until the medication runs out. So we don't need to know anything. We don't need to make any decisions.
It's passive. We're just kind of like sheep shuffling along.
Exactly. And so, you go into a dispensary and you don't realize how you've been trained to be so passive, and you really don't have any understanding of kind of what all the stuff on the shelves is, and that's okay because you don't need to. But when you're, in cannabis, when you walk into a dispensary, all of a sudden you're faced with this, this huge difference, I guess. It's a completely different situation where all of a sudden you're in charge and you have to make all the decisions.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful explanation, because I can totally relate to that. It's like, you walk in for the first time and you're like, okay, I'd like to buy some pot, and you get this menu that's like 3 pages thick and all these different terms that you have no idea what they mean and how they so but there are people there to help, but it is a different, you're right, it's different.
And my brother's experience, and I'm going to say, I don't mean any disrespect to bud tenders or any of the people working in the dispensaries, but my brother has, he has a lot of pain, and he's there and he wants to get rid of his pain. And if he goes in, and again, he's used to the image of a pharmacist, this person in a white coat who he knows is certified and knows what they're talking about. And if he goes into a dispensary, and now I will say it's getting much better over time as the cannabis world is learning to kind of deal better, more appropriately with medical users. But especially earlier on, if you have the people in the dispensaries are more from kind of the OG cannabis world, the recreational use world, they're coming at it from a completely different place. And it's not a matter for my brother of trying to find the best product that will get him the right high or euphoria or sedation or energy or creativity. It's about getting rid of the pain.
Right. It's medicine. It's life, it's quality of life. It's,
Yeah. And, while I certainly understand that, the recreational use is certainly valid, and, I've had alcohol, and I get that whole thing, but it's still, it's on a different level. It's a different part of your quality of life than getting rid of pain. And what you need to trust the bud tender, and who may be someone who's young, who may be someone who looks like they really don't know about multiple sclerosis and pain.
Yeah.
It's really hard for the customer to put their trust in the bud tender, that the bud tender knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
And again, I really mean no disrespect to bud tenders. There's a lot of really smart people out there, but they need to understand that the customers coming to them have kind of preconceptions, and they have expectations. And they really need to understand that, where the patient is coming from. And the bud tender really needs to understand this, empathize with it, and just kind of play to the customer in the sense of, trying to give the customer what the customer really needs.
Yeah, like really listening. And it seems like they almost need a little more training to be able to truly utilize that role in the dispensary. Now, I know in Massachusetts, not a lot, but sometimes pharmacists that you can schedule an appointment with that will, for those, that are on a bunch of other meds or whatnot and want one-on-one with someone that's got the background. But that's new. It's like we're learning as we go along, I think.
Oh, yeah. So, very new industry.
And nobody knows.
And just in the 3 or 4 years that I've been in the industry, it's evolved tremendously. And the bud tenders now seem to be much more aware and much more empathetic. And I'm sure that they'll just continue to improve in the future.
Yep.
But the point here is the patient now, and there's a twist, because cannabis really is individualized medicine. Each person has their own endocannabinoid system, and each person is going to react differently. And so each person is going to need a different product. And so what that means is the patient is really on his own, and it's really up to the patient to take charge of their situation and to understand that they're going to start somewhere. It's probably not going to be the place they end up. They're going to have to, experiment. It's a learning by doing process.
Mm-hmm.
But they need to have enough information to know how to choose products that will get them towards where they need to be going, move them in the direction towards their optimal product and dosing. And so I think cannabis patients are going to have to be much more educated about cannabis than most patients in the traditional healthcare system need to be educated about the other medications they're on.
Yes, absolutely. And trial and error is expensive. So sometimes it's easier to just, not pursue, like if you're getting some results, but they're not ideal, to dial in your cannabis profile. Takes a lot of, try this strain, try that strain, or there's just such a learning curve.
There is, and there's so many varieties and there's so many different variables with all the different cannabinoids and terpenes that again, if you end up at the place you started, you're really lucky. Most people, they're going to have to adjust everything many times and get to their final destination, their optimal dose, only after a series of trials.
Uh-huh. So for your brother, so he goes he's overwhelmed, and at what point did you just...
So he's overwhelmed, and at some point he contacted me and he explained what the situation was. He said, I need some help here. So, if my dad were here, he's the one who would have done it, because growing up, whenever we had a medical problem, my dad would jump in and do the research and help guide us through. But this is after my dad had passed away, unfortunately. And given my, my history and research, and I've done so much work in the healthcare industry, it was pretty natural for me to step in. So I will say that, yes, I had also smoked cannabis or pot in college and decided it, wasn't my thing. And I knew that it was out there in the medical world, but really didn't pay any attention to it. So I come in now, and the situation is my brother has a lot of pain. He has chronic pain. And all I know is I want to do anything I can to help him minimize his pain. And so I go into cannabis, and my job as I saw it was to go in and figure out if cannabis was for real. And if so, help him figure out what would help him. And so the goal here was to cut through all the BS. And I didn't care what, anyone had to say, whether they were pro or anti. All I cared about was finding something that would help reduce my brother's pain. So I drew upon all my past experiences in approaching things, and I started, reading. The first question was, well, what is cannabis and how does it work on the body? And I started reading about that, and wow, it's kind of overwhelming.
Where did you start your own explorations?
I believe I went to PubMed first to look at the medical journals.
I'm just curious, how someone with your background, where they'd go.
Yeah, like I said, I've spent a lot of time in the healthcare arena, and I'm certainly no doctor, and I haven't been trained in that area, but I know enough about the body that I can generally figure things out. But I started reading about cannabis, and I was in over my head. And so I started digging deep, and then said, okay, this is too deep. I need to come up for air here. And then I took a more kind of broader perspective on what is cannabis and why is it so complicated. And so I kind of continued zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out, trying to kind of get an understanding of, okay, well, what's the big picture? What are the big pieces, and how do the pieces fit together to form this big picture? And again, that's that's the approach I take with everything I do.
Well, listening to your background, all your formative experiences come into play.
Yes, exactly. Beautiful. So I started reading, and what really surprised me is, and again, I'm no novice when it comes to doing research. This is what I do, but it really surprised me how complicated it all was. And I was having a really, really tough time trying to put all the pieces together to understand what the big picture is because I would go out and I would read things, and I was reading from all different places. And each thing I read was like a little pinprick on like this huge map. So I have this huge map, and I have I don't even have the outline. So I don't have, like, if you're talking about the United States, I don't even know what the outline of the United States looks like. All I know is that there's some big blank space out there, and I'm trying to fill in the details and understand what the boundary is and, like, where the states are, what are the states, how do they fit together, and all I'm getting is pinpricks.
Wow.
And, I get a pinprick up, over here and one over here. Cannabis has been shown to help reduce pain. Cannabis has been shown, other people are saying, well, cannabis causes schizophrenia.
Yep.
And other people are saying, well, if you use cannabis, then you're going to end up, a truant, you're going to drop out of school,
right.
You're never going to get
drug.
a job. And then you have, well, cannabis cures cancer.
Right. On any given Sunday, what are you going to get? I mean,
yeah, you're getting everything. And really, I kept reading, and I just kept getting more little pinpricks on my map, and it was really, really confusing.
I bet.
And it took me a really long time. And finally, I started kind of figuring things out, and what I realized is there were a couple of different perspectives out there. And once you identified which perspective the piece of information you're looking at comes from, it goes a long way towards telling you kind of how that piece of information you're getting fits into the big picture.
Uh-huh.
And so very briefly, there's pretty much three big areas.
Okay.
You have NIDA, which is the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And this is the stuff that I grew up with, which is this is your brain on drugs.
On drugs. Yep, me too.
And it's the part of the National Institute of Health that provides funding to study the causes and consequences of drug abuse. So if you want to study how pot messes up your life and harms your brain, causes you to go crazy, causes you to be a criminal and a rapist, if you want to find all that out, you go to the NIDA studies, and they will tell you, you will go to NIDA, NIDA will give you funding, and you can get a study. There are tons of studies out there on this. And so, when I was researching and trying to find, lists of journal articles, I would get tons and tons of journal articles on all the bad effects. And so I finally understood, okay, there was this funding arm out there that was providing funds to study this. So if you were in cannabis and you were especially an early researcher and wanted to study cannabis, the place that the money was to study how cannabis is bad for you. So there's all sorts of studies on that.
Yes, there is.
And I eventually found out much later that, so the NIH, the National Institute on Health, is it's a government department within the U.S. government. And the NIH from the U.S. government is the largest global funder of research in the world. So it provides more funding for medical research than any other source of funding globally.
I did not know that.
In 1937, with the Marijuana Tax Act, the funds for research, essentially, there were massive restrictions put on research, and funds essentially dried up. Not fully, there was a trickle of funding, but they largely dried up, except for NIDA. And so you had this, and this is in 1970 with the Controlled Substances Act, when cannabis was officially categorized as a Schedule I drug. At that time, NIDA was created, and all of a sudden there's this one department within the National Institute of Health that had all this money to study the bad effects of cannabis. If you want to study the good effects, then it's really hard to get funding, and it's really onerous. There's a lot of restrictions. You have to, file with the DEA and get permission from them. You have to go through all these hoops with the government. It's really difficult, and it's really stigmatized. It could hurt your career if you do this.
To this day.
So, I mean, it's getting better, but it was like that for decades and decades. So when you go into the medical literature, you see a lot of the stuff from NIDA, which is all the stuff, and it surveys. Well, we went and we looked at, troubled adults, and this is like the gateway drug. Cannabis is a gateway drug that, people end up taking harder drugs and alcohol and whatnot. So that's all the NIDA stuff. So that's one perspective out there. Another perspective is the traditional healthcare industry. And the traditional industry, there are studies out there, early studies too, on cannabis, but they're all preclinical. So what they're doing is people are in a lab and they're looking at human cells in a petri dish, or they're looking at animals, and they're using synthetic cannabinoids, or they're using purified compounds. And they're taking these pure compounds or synthetics and applying them either in animals or in cells to see what will happen. And so there's a lot of early research, and they're trying to figure out how does cannabis work on the body. And it's really complicated, and there's a ton of research out there, very piecemeal. Again, looking at this piece and that piece, and if we look at brain cells, if we look at heart cells, if we look at, whatever. And again, it's very scattered and disconnected. And it's hard to really get a big picture. It's clear that there's no one person out there directing the research saying, okay, we want to figure this out. And in order to do this, this is what we need to do.
Right,
no
right.
No one's doing that.
No one's doing that, yeah. So what's the third?
So going back to that, what's really important about the medical industry is the mindset. So in the 1850s, you get the germ theory of disease, and that's where they figure out that, you have these germs, and that when we want to use medications, we don't want to use, say, willow bark, which is the source of aspirin. We want to purify the aspirin from the willow bark so that we don't get any other contaminants and we don't get other things that might complicate the way the aspirin works in our body. So everything in healthcare is about purified, isolated compounds. And so all of the studies from the traditional healthcare perspective deal with isolated cannabinoids, and particularly most of the research has been done on THC, but you also have synthetics that have been done, and then more recently some CBD. But what they're doing is they're isolating the compound and using that in isolation and using that in the body and seeing what happens.
Which is such a tiny, tiny piece.
Yes.
Wow.
And so now the third piece is kind of the OG, the original growers, or the ocean grown, or depending on, the acronym has a lot of different potential definitions.
Yes, it does.
But these are the traditional cannabis people.
Okay.
So for decades, while cannabis, actually almost since the very beginning, since like the 50s, 60s especially, since cannabis was outlawed, there has always been a grassroots movement, especially by compassionate care users, saying cannabis is medicine. And we need to legalize cannabis because people need it for medicine. And this grassroots movement has been going on for decades.
Yes.
And so I see them kind of as the heart of the cannabis medicine group or subgroup within the cannabis industry. And these people come from the holistic, whole plant medicine mindset. So these are like herbalists. And what they say is, this plant has been around since the beginning of time, and people have been using it since the beginning of time, and they generally smoke it, or at least they use extracts from the whole plant, and they're using all the nutrients in the plant together. They all enable each other. They create synergies. And we need to use the whole plant together in the body to create the best benefits.
Okay. So there's, very, very, like while you're talking, light bulbs are going off. I mean, I think on some level, I know this, but not know it in a factual way.
Right, right.
Yeah. So then, so go from here. Yeah.
Let me take a step back. So
Sure.
As I'm learning all this research, I'm talking to my brother, well, try this, try this, try this. And he's finding that, lo and behold, it's working. So our information is good. So It does work.
Were you surprised?
Yeah, quite frankly.
I had to ask.
Yeah. Like I said, I went in and I had priors. I grew up thinking drugs are bad.
Of course, I did too.
But I had heard about it for medical use, and I'm thinking, okay, well, maybe people just want to get high. But I went in and I said, okay, regardless of how I might think, what I want is the truth, and I want to know, can this help my brother? And so I tried to put aside all my biases and said, okay, I want to look at this from as an objective point of view as possible and try and gather information, and based on all my training and experience, figure out what should I believe. And so that's kind of how I sifted through everything, and I'm feeding information to my brother, and he's using it, and lo and behold, it's working.
Wow.
So now it's been very complicated to this point, and my brother's an engineer, and the comment he makes is, you know, I'm no dummy, I'm an engineer, but I guess it takes a Ph.D. to figure it all out because I have a Ph.D. So,
oh, that's funny.
Yeah, so he'd worked on different technologies before, and he came up with this idea on how to help other new users like him better move through the process that he was trying to move through to find the right product for him.
Oh, interesting.
And so we kind of decided to build a business around this. And he's the one who does the programming, and he does the interface, and he kind of does the design and puts all the pieces together. And I figure out which pieces need to be included and how they work together. So I'm designing kind of the algorithms.
Wow, that sounds so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole new level of research. You know, okay, now I really need to put all the pieces together because I really need to understand this in a way that I can reduce it to something more tangible. Yeah.
So you started this company. This in the timeline. How long ago did you start?
We started it. This is back near in the beginning. It was 2016.
Okay.
And at some point we had to pivot because we had come up with one idea and that wasn't working, and it turned out to not be feasible or whatever.
Okay.
And we pivoted, and at some point we ended up with the version that we have now. The problem is so, you know, I've only been in the industry 4 years, and relative to a lot of people, that's a lifetime. But still, you know, there's people who've been in it for decades.
Yeah.
It's been moving so fast. So the idea we came up with, based on all my research, I think it's the way to approach the problem. The problem is that the industry isn't yet developed enough to be able to implement it. There's not enough information out there in order to be able to do it. And there's other people who are doing stuff out there. And yes, you need to start somewhere. And I don't want to say that everyone else is wrong, but I think that once we get more information and more information, you know, becomes more readily available, that people are going to change the way that they view the industry. And you're seeing some of that now. So when I first came into it, everyone's talking about sativa and indica. So you have kind of the classic OG paradigm of, you know, the sativa will make you more creative or energized, and the indica will help put you to sleep. And they've been discovering that it's more complicated than that. And they've been discovering that, you know, people have been going in and they've been getting all these profile names and actually doing an analysis of the chemicals contained in the profiles. And you can have one strain from different sources have completely different profiles.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this has come about, it's not completely nefarious. It's not total fraud. The problem is there's been so much crossbreeding and hybridization that originally you started out with two relatively distinct strains. I don't know. I can't say that for sure. But over time, they've been mixed so much that much of the distinction has been lost.
Yeah, I've heard that from other people. Yep.
And so what the research seems to be saying is it's not so much the strain that tells you what types of effects you're going to get, but the underlying profile of compounds.
So and the cannabinoids that they're still discovering.
And the terpenes.
And the terpenes. Okay, right.
And it gets more complicated, and that's because the profile of a particular sample will change over time as the sample passes through the supply chain, because the profile changes, you know, as it's oxidized, as it's aged, as it's heated. And so if you check the profile when the plant was harvested, and then you take it through and you extract it while you're heating it, and you're also oxidizing it to some extent, so the profile's now changed. And then if it sits on the shelf for a couple of years, well, it's oxidizing or aging, so it's changing again. And so it turns out to be really complicated.
Really complicated. I mean, that's like...
Yeah.
an infinite number of variables.
Yes, yes. And it's good news and it's bad news.
Okay.
So the bad news is it's really complicated, and anyone who's trying to figure this out is going to get lost really quickly. And the more I know, the less I feel I understand.
Yeah.
And the good news is they're learning so much, and they're learning how different combinations can do these amazing things. And as they learn, they're discovering new cannabinoids all the time, and they're discovering new terpenes, and they're discovering new ways that combinations of cannabinoids and terpenes can help. So I think in the future that the applications of cannabis and different profiles of compounds and the applications to all the different medical conditions, I think it's going to mushroom.
Do you?
I do. I think it's going to take them a long time to figure it all out.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the potential is really amazing. And all the people who think that it's just total crap and people just want to get high. Well, yeah, some people want to get high, but it's not crap. It's doing amazing things.
Yeah, it's like a Pandora's box of like a new pharmacy, of like a whole new level of discovery. It seems like to me that we're sitting on.
It is. And actually, so when I started reading about it and started reading about how it works on our bodies, what I found out is they discovered this system in our bodies. It's a natural system that cannabis works on. So we have the system in our body, the endocannabinoid system, and our body makes its own endocannabinoids just like THC and CBD. So our body has the system, and what the system is responsible is regulating everything else in our body. So what the system that cannabis controls or acts on is really kind of a fundamental system in our body that makes sure everything else is working okay. And because so many people, their systems are not working okay, they're out of whack. That's why we're seeing so many problems, but that's also why cannabis can help them.
So like an endocannabinoid deficiency.
Yes. And Ethan Russo came up with this theory that there are these systemic problems that people have, like fibromyalgia, irritable bowel syndrome, certain types of migraine. What they are systemic problems in your body, and they're fundamental problems with your monitoring system, which is your endocannabinoid system. So it's essentially like it's your primary thermostat to make sure that your body's not going out of range in all the various symptoms. And all your endocannabinoid system controls all your glands. It controls all your muscles. So anyone with muscle issues, with twitches, I don't know about atrophy, but certainly with muscle movement, spasm, cramp, they could almost assuredly benefit from cannabis. And anyone with glandular problems, which is pretty much everything, hunger, appetite, mood, sex drive, it controls everything. And those are all set by secretions of chemicals, which cannabis can affect.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. And so our own endocannabinoid system, we are responsible. By doing certain activities and engaging in, a healthy lifestyle, our internal endocannabinoid system is okay. But when it goes out of whack, that's when these systemic conditions start to set in or whatnot, and can be corrected with phytocannabinoids. Is that?
Yes, that's exactly right.
So at what point did you decide to write the book?
So I was doing all this research in order to be able to design the algorithms for our technology. And at some point, I had kind of finally gotten the outline of my puzzle defined and built in enough pieces that I could see kind of the general shape of how things were working. Now, certainly there's a ton of stuff missing, but I got a handle on it. And at that point, through all this, I'm talking to my brother saying, wow, listen to this, listen to this, listen to this. And in some ways, like, we've got so much information, we should put it in a book for other people. And so, I had already kind of put it all together for the technology. So we then turned around and put it into a book. And my brother, he does everything digital. He's a publisher. He's a photographer.
Wow, that's cool. So he
does layout and design. This is kind of what he does. So kind of the two of us So if you go out and, I had seen some cannabis books out there, and there's a lot of, you look at them and there's a lot of text. And text is kind of hard. People will buy it and they'll look at the text and go, yeah, no, I don't want to invest in reading that. It doesn't look real friendly.
Yeah, yeah. Especially about something like cannabis, where there's just so many moving pieces.
Yes, and another thing is it's absolutely not linear.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was thinking. You put it into words. Yeah, it's all over the place.
And so kind of the way I think is definitely not linear. I think in terms of bullet points and tables and graphs and charts, and they're kind of all over the place. Mm-hmm. And so when I was collecting all the information for myself, it's all coming out in tabular and graphic form, and that's not really the way you communicate in a book. And my brother is a photographer, and I mean, that was really cool. He started going out and working with, a couple of the pharmacies and some people and getting some really good photos and taking people on a pictorial journey of everything that we're going through. And so there's this whole section at the beginning on the plan and pictures, and, we're talking to people, and I was talking to people in the healthcare industry, and they said, one of the problems is doctors have no idea what any of these products look like. So you go into a pharmacy or you'll see products in a book and you see like a vial or whatever, and you think, oh, that thing's maybe, 5-6 inches in diameter. Mm-hmm. Well, no, they're like an inch.
Little tiny things. Yeah. Yeah. And there was a ton of picture. I mean, that's one thing that I noticed. Well, one of the many things that I noticed is like how I was thinking when I was reading it, like, how were all these products like, yeah, it's the first one that I saw that had all these visuals with different products and different compositions of cannabis, and just, beautiful.
Yes, and it's all color. My brother was one of the early pioneers in digital color when that came out. So everything's color, and it's very enticing, and it's so much easier to move through cannabis and the whole journey with the pictures, so you can see kind of what's going on.
Yes.
And it's actually kind of interesting. We have some diagrams in there of the picture of the cannabis plant, and there's some diagrams that my brother actually created because I was trying to figure out, okay, well, where do the cannabinoids come from? It's kind of like, you're talking chicken nuggets. What part of a chicken are the nuggets?
Okay.
Well, where are the cannabinoids in the plant? And we're trying to understand the plant. And I had like a dozen different sources that I had gone through, and they have diagrams. And they're pointing to the plant saying, this is the bracton, this is the trichome, and this is, the stem and the leaf and everything. And the problem is they would have this big picture of a plant that's like a tiny picture, and they would have a big arrow, so the arrow doesn't hit anything in particular. And they would say, this is the trichome. And you're like, okay, that's no help. I can't see where the arrow is supposed to be pointing to. And then you have different pictures where they're including some pieces but not others. And if you compare across the different pictures, you get a very inconsistent idea of what's going on. So at one point, my brother and I are on the phone and we're having a debate. I'm like, okay, no, look at this picture. And, I'm showing him pictures on the internet. I'm like, this picture says this. And he's like, well, this picture says this. And it took both of us like an hour going through all these pictures, trying to figure out exactly how all the pieces fit together. And so there were some diagrams that he had to actually create because we couldn't find good ones.
Yeah, like those details. I've never seen the pieces of the, like you said, the bract and the coal, just parts of it that like you hear these terms and
And it makes it so much, the shatter and the wax. And I was reading through this and I was reading articles and I kept hearing these terms. And I'm like, what is shatter? What is wax? What is live resin and cured? And it turns out that people are mixing and matching terms. So some of them are talking about
the same thing.
No, they're combining terms from different things. It's talking about a cookie, and they're saying, well, you have flour and you have chocolate chip and you have eggs and you have oatmeal raisin and you have baking, and you're like, well, wait, you're talking about different stages of the cookie, not different cookies or different ingredients. You're mixing them all together. So some of them were talking about the processing, and some of them were talking about the end product, and some of them were talking about the inputs into the processing. And
Oh
so
my
again,
gosh.
it took me a really, really long time to figure out, okay, here are all the inputs, here are the different processes. And when you put different inputs into different processes, then you get different outputs.
Yeah, and you put the way that these diagrams are laid out, there's the different layers of it. So, I mean, I have to read, it's a book that I will reference. It's not like you're going to read through it and pick it up one time through. There's just tons of information. And the terminology, I didn't even know.
Yeah, everything was new to me. And actually, the first place I started in the book was, again, this is, coming from the stigma, and so many people are afraid of cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many people out there just saying it's not been proven to be safe or effective. I started the book with, okay, is cannabis safe and effective? What did the study say? And it was really interesting, and I learned a lot, and it was really confusing, because I found a lot of studies where if you go into the details, and especially there's this, one government report where if you look at one of the conclusions, the bullet point says, okay, it's been found safe and effective for pain. And then you look at one of the conclusions and it says, well, it's still inconclusive and we can't make any determination as to pain. And it's like, okay, well, 3 pages earlier,
Yeah.
you said, and so the same source can make very contradictory comments. And so you have for as many people as there are who say, well, there's no evidence, you can find other people who say, well, there's evidence.
Right.
And,
And that's always been, yeah, like in my discussions with people, I'll be very vocal about my belief in the powers of cannabis. No, there's no studies. There's no evidence. And I'm like, well, yeah, there is. I've read it. It's all over the place.
So what's going on with that, and this is my interpretation, is there's literally tens of thousands of studies. There's on the order of 40,000 studies on cannabis. I mean, roughly. And a lot of those are preclinical, meaning you have people looking in cells in a lab or in animals.
Right, you talked
about that. And while those can give you some indication, again, going back to the systems thing, the way that cannabis works in your body is really complicated. It's like a pinball machine. It's going into your body and it's hitting all sorts of things. So the way it's going to act in isolation is not going to be the same as the way it's going to act in a lab. And they've also been finding that the way it acts in mice and rabbits is not necessarily the same as it acts in people. So there are a ton of studies out there that are preclinical.
Okay.
There's another whole group of studies that are the NIDA studies that are mostly surveys where they're working with a lot of people who have drug abuse problems. And they say, okay, these people took cannabis and now they have schizophrenia, or now they're in jail, or, they never got a job or whatever.
They're looking through a very specific lens.
Yes, and again, it's problematic, and they tend to suffer from the distinction between causation and correlation. Just because someone who takes cannabis also has schizophrenia doesn't mean the cannabis caused the schizophrenia. It could be that people were taking it to self-medicate. The cannabis has actually been found to relieve a lot of the symptoms of schizophrenia.
Mm-hmm.
And so it could be that, the people who end up finally manifesting schizophrenia, early on they knew something wasn't right and they were using cannabis to help manage the symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I will say there are people with a pre-genetic disposition towards schizophrenia. And if they take cannabis, cannabis has been shown to bring out the schizophrenia earlier. So if you have a predisposition, you might not want to use it. I'm definitely not advocating the use for that.
Yeah.
But again, you have, especially the young juvie people, the kids who end up, going to jail or getting as a gateway drug using harder drugs. Well, gee, isn't it more likely that people who have problems maybe at home, they don't come from a good home environment, they're looking to escape? So these are the people who are going to use cannabis, but these are the people who are not going to make it to college, and they're not necessarily going to have a good job because, they're just not on that life path.
Right.
So
it's not the cannabis.
Caused them. Right.
We're looking at like the social determinants of health there.
Yes. And so I discovered that most of the studies that I read, and I say most because I don't like using the word all, but I can't think of one that comes to mind that didn't suffer from this causation versus correlation problem. So they were generally picking up correlations. Then you have human trials, clinical trials in cannabis. You have a lot that are small samples. And when people in the healthcare industry say there's no evidence that cannabis has been shown to be safe and effective, what they mean is not no studies, period. They mean no large-scale clinical trials.
Right.
And a large-scale clinical trial is very expensive, and it's generally done by someone who's seeking FDA approval for a pharmaceutical.
Yeah.
So I mean, there are certain pharmaceutical cannabinoids out there, cannabis products, and they've gone through a number of clinical trials. But again, those are isolates.
Yes.
And the people who are doing the whole plant medicine and who are finding really amazing results, they don't have the money to fund large-scale clinical trials. And I'm not trying to make an excuse. I'm trying to explain why that evidence doesn't exist.
That's helpful. Yeah. I mean, because I come up against that all the time talking to people.
And kind of what I say is, there's tons of case studies, and you have to take a case study with a grain of salt. But when you have, over the history of time, literally millions or billions of case studies, and if you have people who have been standing by it for decades, there's got to be some truth to that.
You can't look away. I mean, when people are getting the kinds of results where they're, all kinds of symptoms they have evidence that these are being diminished or eliminated. It seems like that we cannot turn away from that forever.
I absolutely agree. I think it has tremendous potential. I will say I do not think it's a cure-all. I do not think that every person will not every person will definitely benefit from it, although I've read that something like 80% of people have gotten benefits.
Wow,
I think 80%. It will go a huge way in helping a lot of people with a lot of problems. And I think it's very unfortunate, but the whole stigma in cannabis throughout its history in society has been due to purely political and financial interests. There were people who stood to benefit financially from not having cannabis legalized. And so they've been keeping cannabis out of the market. And the idea that it's not safe or effective, I think, is just wrong.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say, I think the way forward and through this is through more education.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you. How do we work to overcome the stigma and mindset? It's education.
It's education. It's education on all levels. There's so many people who are afraid of it. We have friends of the family. The guy is a pediatrician, and he's in his 80s or 90s, and he's in tremendous pain. And people close to him have suggested that he might want to try cannabis, and he's like, "No, I don't want to get addicted." Here's someone who's 90s, in pain, and he's worried about addiction, and it's the stigma. And some people are not going to get past that. But I think that we need to be more open. We need more education.
Yeah, especially for the doctors. I guess that's one thing that I see in the communities that I'm involved with is people think the doctors understand cannabinoid medicine and understand how it affects the other medicines. And I don't think that there's the level of education out there on behalf of the doctors that they should even be able. It just seems very scary when people are on multiple medications and they're not willing to share how cannabinoid product might influence. It's putting people at risk is what I see.
So the problem is the endocannabinoid system was only discovered in the early 90s. So we've only known about it for roughly 30 years. Most doctors have zero training. They don't know about the system. The doctors now who know about it are because they looked it up on their own or learning about it on their own. Mm-hmm. It's only just starting to be incorporated into medical programs.
That's what I'm hearing.
And so doctors don't have any education about this. Another thing is that traditionally, when doctors think about prescribing medications for their patients, what they rely on is information from the FDA on drug safety and efficacy and dosing and guidance. And the problem is the information that the FDA gets all come from the clinical trials to get pharmaceuticals approved. So when the drugs go through the FDA approval process, they're doing the clinical trials, they're doing all the studies, and this is how the FDA gets information that they make available to doctors. The doctors then use to inform themselves on how to treat their patients. And you can imagine that if you're a doctor and you have no training and you really don't have any good information, do you really want to recommend that someone use
it's
that?
It's got to be terrifying, truly.
Yeah.
I feel bad. I can't imagine, especially as more and more people are using cannabis, and I can only imagine.
It's really, so I can understand how they wouldn't necessarily want to recommend it. The big problem I have is the people who are closed to it and who have patients who are afraid to tell them that they're using cannabis, because now you're missing all the interactions. And now you're going to have people using it with zero oversight from their doctors, and you're going to cause all sorts of problems. So I think the first step is for the doctors to start learning from the patients and just being open to it. I know that my brother had a neurologist, and very early on, he had some really, really bad symptoms. And very early on, he was going through things, and he got to the point many times where he's like, I am willing to try anything to address this problem. And at one point, he got to diet, and he put himself on a very limited diet, and lo and behold, that solved a lot of his problems. And he went to one of his neurologists, and his neurologist was making different recommendations, and my brother said, well, I changed my diet, and that has really helped. And the neurologist said, yeah, I've heard that from other patients, but I really know nothing about nutrition, so I can't really comment on that. And that doctor did end up becoming informed on nutrition and actually now incorporates that into his program.
That's great. I mean, we can't expect doctors to know everything.
Right. But so when the doctors need to be open to it, and they need to be open to their patients coming to them and saying, listen, I've been trying cannabis and it really seems to be working. Can you help me? And at that point, the doctors really need to say, okay, let's try and figure this out. And I know that's not easy for the doctors, and they already have a zillion other things they need to be doing. But if the doctors are going to be closed to their patients, the patients are going to find someone else who can help them. And so I think the medical industry is largely going to be dragged into this unwillingly by their patients.
Yeah. And it does encompass a completely different mindset, and cannabinoid medicine requires such individualization. It just goes against everything that they're taught. And as you've already illustrated or talked about
it's hard for the doctor because he's used to being the authority, and all of a sudden he's put in a position where he doesn't know anything, and it's scary. It's scary to admit that you know less than your patient, and it's scary to admit that you really have no idea what you're doing and that you need to give advice to someone that might affect their well-being. And another thing I learned from my brother and his neurologist is, doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. They take that really seriously. And so, they're always thinking about, is this going to hurt my patient? And they don't want to give something to their patient if they think that there's a good chance that it may hurt them. The problem here is that the riskiness and the risk that the doctor is willing to take are different from the risk the patients are willing to undertake. In a lot of cases, the patients are not doing well, and they're willing to take a lot more risk than the doctor.
Right.
And in that case, that you need to clarify when the doctor's saying, no, you shouldn't take cannabis. Well, is that based on the doctor's risk aversion or the patient's risk aversion?
Interesting. Yeah. That I didn't understand that until we talked about it. Yeah. Important points. Yeah. I've gotten so much information from you in this episode, and
I'm delighted.
It's been wonderful.
More than anything, cannabis has been so amazing to me. The world of cannabis, I have never seen so many people whose lives have been radically transformed by something, and who are so passionate about helping others discover that power. And there's so many people who are amazing, who are trying to spread the word, and I'm really trying to do the same thing. So I'm really trying to do my part to educate people about cannabis and the amazing potential.
Yeah, I felt the same enthusiasm just kind of coming into this recently, and very supportive and collaborative in lots of ways. So where can people find your book? And I will post any of your links on when I write up the show notes. But if you want to give a shout out, it's the Medical Cannabis Primer, and it's on Amazon.
Medical Cannabis Primer. It's available on Amazon.
Okay.
And we also have a website for it, medicalcannabisprimer.com. You can get more information there with links to Amazon, or you can buy it off the site.
Okay. And what your business now? Did you want to give any kind of a website for that? Or?
For the cannabis business, there's not a lot there, but I've done a lot of research on kind of the cannabis industry,
okay.
And that's it. That's on Quanta, my website for my market dynamics business, QUANTAA.com.
Okay. Yeah, this has been great, Ruth. Is there anything that I missed that you want to mention?
I just want to thank you for what you're doing. One of the most amazing things about the internet is connecting people, and especially people with kind of rare problems, where people are able to find one another and learn from one another and get really the support that they were never able to get before. And what you're doing is enabling that, and it's really amazing. And I want to say thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, it's been a journey, and I feel really like I'm being led in some way down this path of exploration and connection. So, all right, I think that's a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to our podcast, TSC Talks. Please feel free to navigate to our website, www.tsctalks.com. Please try to support us, make a contribution, say a prayer, leave a review. Tell us you love us, you hate us, but thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for more.